Good afternoon, morning or evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. My name's Peter Wooding, and I'm delighted to welcome today Justin Benson, David Hudson, and Ron Lee, who are steering us through lots of sort of powertrain developments in our special leaders session. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Justin, who will start the proceedings on. Thanks, Justin, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Benson. I'm going to kick off with a brief, if you like, state of the nation, focusing a bit on the UK and Western Europe, and just to see where the car industry or car sales, if you will, is going. And that'll be about 15 minutes maximum, I would have thought. And then after that, we've got some great guys for a bit of a panel discussion and to answer your questions. We've got plenty to talk about and can do that. And we'll fill the time in well. I really believe that. So, but if there's any burning questions that you have, please do let us know. I'm Justin Benson. I'm a partner at Vendigital. Joined them about 9 months ago after a 20-year career at KPMG. And really enjoying it. The focus of ours is very much on engineering in automotive, looking at how you build vehicles and how you think about your supply chains. And in particular, electric vehicles has been a real growth area over the last 12 months or so, and an area that is getting, I think, particularly interesting now and will continue to do so over the next few years, as I'm sure you will all be aware. But let me kick off a little bit with, unfortunately, a bit of bad news, which, that's what I do on these things. I've updated this. For those of you who have seen our presentation before, we're just looking at the UK market here against all drivetrains. And if you see, this is it's a flipped picture because the 2020 curve is the one below the 2019 curve. And of course, COVID has caused a lot of problems for the industry. And this is basically sales of cars in the UK. So registrations, to be exact, but clearly COVID has caused a problem this year. The interesting thing is that back in August, when I did this presentation last time, it was near a 40% hit. So arguably the business is coming back, and albeit a bit slowly, and certainly the numbers are down, for obvious reasons. But on the other hand, on the real positive side, which is quite interesting, is battery electric vehicles. Again, showed this last time, and it was a similar story, but it's increasing even more now. The rate of purchase of electric vehicles is increasing, and as you can see, very much now the 2020 registrations are above the last year's registrations, which is always a good thing from a growth perspective. But if you look at the bottom there, the market share number, so this time last year was about 1.5% market share. Now, I grant you we're on a smaller total number, but nevertheless, people are seriously thinking about buying electric vehicles. Now, and remember, this is BEV. I haven't done anything separate to include, in the UK anyway, the PHEVs and the other hybrids, of which there are numerous, and that number would be even higher. But I wanted to focus on BEVs because I do feel that this year, perhaps more so than next year, I think we'll all look back at next year as being the real inflection point. But I just feel at the moment, I think we as a panel here today feel like we are in the middle of it right at this moment in time, because it's quite exciting the way that it's going with battery electric vehicles and all the issues around them, infrastructure and everything else. But it's really motoring on, to coin a pun. Moving on to Western Europe and passenger car registrations, as you can see, there was a little bit of fighting over who was leading the way, but Germany clearly have taken a big jump over the last few months, probably for obvious reasons, and I'll go into a bit more detail on that shortly. But these are the top 5 markets, and they're the sorts of curves we all love to see in our businesses. This is the kind of curve we want to see, growth. And that's certainly what's happening now in battery electric vehicles. Certainly the numbers are, let's put it this, often people say to me, yes, Justin, that's fine, but it's all from a low base. Well, I think that low base now is increasing. It is raising, that bar is rising. So each year so far now, the increases are quite substantial. So I think we're in for some more growth going forward. Germany, as you can see, is really shot ahead. I'll come back to that in a moment. I've left this is a pure copy from something I showed last time in August. Things have moved on a bit. I'm not sure that we will have, we've talked about likely scenarios as to where this is going for the market, and we were sort of resting on a W curve. My friends at Cox Automotive, this is one of their older slides, but I wanted you to focus on the right hand side. This was it's moved on a little bit, but I do think the macro issues are quite important to bear in mind. I mean, not least Brexit, which we might get onto in the conversation shortly, but the GDP growth, unemployment growth, or hopefully lack of it, and consumer spending growth are going to be key numbers, I think, next year as we get into particularly the second quarter. So if you'd have asked me about 6 weeks ago that we'd be, what kind of situation we'd be seeing, I think we'd be all right up until December, and then I think Q1 would really start to see some concerns. But with furlough being extended up until the end of March, I think there's a feeling that that could hold up consumer demand for a little bit longer. Maybe not consumer spending, but certainly demand out there, and potentially hold back unemployment a little bit. Having said that, in my conversations, and we can perhaps ask my colleagues here today similar things, but we are seeing plans for some redundancies in the auto sector, but also more generally in various sectors, as people are learning about the ways in which they work differently, they handle things differently. In the auto space, for example, I know it's an overused term, but agility comes up in every conversation. The speed at which they can do things. They keep asking themselves, if we can make ventilators this fast, if we can make vaccines this fast, if we can do X this fast, why can't we make cars a lot faster, or make engines a lot faster, or battery packs a lot faster? So all these sorts of things are now in play and having a big effect on the way C-suites are looking at how they become more efficient and grow their businesses in the future. This is a sort of slightly personal slide for me, but this comes back to my point about when I talked about Germany and their sort of faster growth perhaps than the rest of the bigger markets in Europe. And there's some detail there on the left-hand side. I mean, this hasn't changed much in the last 12 months. The drivers are very clear. So incentives has had a big help, and I think in Germany in particular, and France to a greater or lesser extent, they are having a big effect on people thinking about a battery electric vehicle rather than other drivetrains. UK, as you're aware, still haven't put any additional incentives in play. Having said that, they are spending, in my view, significant amounts on the supply side, if you will. So supporting manufacturing, supporting R&D, really trying to support the UK industry and understanding what all this, battery electric vehicles and what zero emissions decarbonisation actually means. And I think it does go a bit wider than just vehicles, but we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. But these are the sorts of things which are driving things. EU regulation, of course. CO2 targets is a massive driver, and one in 4 cars now from Mercedes, for example, is a plug-in vehicle, not necessarily all battery, but in order for them to achieve the CO2 regulations, they've got to be selling a lot more PHEVs and BEVs into their portfolio. And we've talked about the experiences we've all had, I think, over the last 9-12 months around the clean air change in and the general change in education around climate change, and there's so much greater knowledge in the marketplace about the effect that me as an individual or families or businesses are having on climate change, and that is certainly having a factor as well. But the regulation, I think, is the absolute core one at the moment. And I boxed out a couple of just additional stats there at the bottom left. You may remember when I did this before, we were thinking that the sort of generally held view in Western Europe was that we'd be selling about 600,000 battery electric vehicles in Western Europe. But that is going to be expected to be over 1 million by the end of this month. We won't know that until towards the end of December, but it's looking like that at the moment. And the BEV only forecast, so only BEVs, looks like it could be as much as 620,000 in Western Europe. And you saw the numbers for the UK earlier. You know, we're looking at best part of 100,000 of that potentially this year, which is, you know, which is pretty significant, albeit from, you know, a low base. But I would, you know, we do that again next year, you're talking about fast growth. The right hand side, I haven't changed those points of view. I'm thinking about it though, because the alternative view is basically mine. I just added some numbers to the pundits, if you like, which is the top, which I think is very conservative. And there are some supply side issues. You know, there will be supply side issues. There'll be supply chain issues. You know, that not least, you know, the elements we need to mine from the ground, etc. So perhaps we can touch on that in the Q&A. But certainly the trajectory is very much on the up for these reasons. Just a quick slide on capacity. Some might say, well, can we actually make all these vehicles, Justin? Well, capacity is increasing. This is just Germany itself, and they are going to be, I think, an absolute powerhouse for electric vehicles in the future, not least because of Volkswagen's investment. And when I last did this in August, it was about 10%. It was July, yes, it was just under 10%. And now it's jumped to about 15% now of total car production in Germany is now moving towards the plug-in type hybrids. And in fact, it's the PHEVs, the PHEVs, which have probably driven a lot of that and driven the increase in market share over the last few months. So this is the competitive environment. I like this again because the curves are trending upwards, while at the same time, you know, the big companies in Europe are jockeying for position. It's interesting to see who's doing well over time. I mean, Tesla obviously burst onto the market earlier this year, did exceptionally well, but they're balancing out. Again, their sales are going up, like most of these. The battery electric vehicle based vehicles are going up in pretty much every case. But actually, the interesting thing is it's jockeying for market share now, and how that's happening over the next next perhaps 1 or 2 years is going to be very interesting as all the new models start to come into the market. I think particularly from VW, because I think they've got a very exciting range coming up, and you've got lots of new models coming out from all of these companies, as you will know. So just for me to finish off with just a couple of, I guess, messages that there's been an awful lot of investment in electric vehicles over the last 5-10 years, and it's been increasing quite dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years. But cost competitiveness is becoming key because of volumes. Because if you've been making 1,000 or so many vehicles, or you know, a few prototypes, when you've got to turn that into a high quality volume product, you know, whether it be a commercial vehicle even, or whether it be a passenger vehicle, you've really got to get the quality right, but also cost competitiveness in your supply chain. And we're seeing that all over. And we're working with clients at the moment, taking out some significant cost out of their electric drivetrain vehicles. It's a really interesting area, and one where there can be a lot more to be done. The other interesting part about there's new entrants coming in, and I'd say particularly in commercial vehicles. You've probably seen a number of bus manufacturers coming into the market recently. You're seeing a lot of money being raised on markets here and in the US. There's a lot of companies out there now building battery-based electric vehicles, and that's creating a much more competitive environment at the same time. Supply chain, linking back to the cost competitiveness part. What I'm seeing is that all the different parts of the supply chain are reviewing costs at the moment. Perhaps blindingly obvious, but if you're not, I think you should be, because over the years, with the businesses as they've been growing, what we're finding is those businesses have grown, is that areas of the business have become inefficient or need a focus, whether you're selling the vehicle, building it, or working as a supplier. And there's some real opportunities there that we're seeing at the moment. I'm just thinking, I mentioned the example of taking out dollars per electric motor, for example. But even dealers, if you're looking at their cost base, we're seeing figures anywhere up to 30% being taken out of some of the some parts of their cost base in order to make them more efficient as they push the cars into the market. And with this change in demand and change in the sales profile of their customers, with more battery electric vehicles coming on board, there are opportunities there to become more efficient. In doing that, final point, joining up the systems. I mean, I don't know how many work for big, large companies, but often have disparate systems that don't always give you the right data. What we're finding is when we have gone into some of our clients and looked at their data and actually brought it together in a way from their disparate systems, we've been able to give them some incredible insights as to how to reduce cost or make the business more efficient, or just sell more kit. So again, I would suggest looking at that as well. I hope that's it's not meant as an advert. I guess it is, but hopefully that's helpful in just making you think a little bit as well about what are the implications of some of the data and the things that I was saying in the previous slides. With that, on that note, I think I'll come out of the presentation and check for questions. But I think while we're waiting for questions and any thoughts on that, I've got Ron Lee and David Hudson. Perhaps, guys, you could introduce yourselves, and then we can perhaps start the conversation from there and see who wants to get involved. David, would you like to go first? You're on mute, David.
First technical fail of the day. So yeah, I'm David Hudson. I head the Vehicle and Powertrain engineering groups at Tata Motors European Technical Centre. We've been established for 15 years, based at Warwick University, and working on future engineering concepts for Tata's Indian operations, so separate from Jaguar Land Rover, who have, of course, their own substantial operations. We're the advanced guard for products for the South Asian market. We've been active in the field of electric vehicles for over 12 years, including concept vehicles for low-cost hatchback type electric vehicles, such as we're now starting to launch in the markets in India. So involved also with autonomy and connectivity projects as well, but outside the scope of today's discussion.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Ron.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, before joining the ranks of consultants, I'd had a 35-year career in automotive powertrain business, predominantly with Jaguar and then Jaguar Land Rover in its various guises. And the last 17 years of that was as global director of powertrain for Jaguar Land Rover. And so during that period, I oversaw the ramp up of Jaguar as a standalone IC-based manufacturer as it spun out from Ford. And then overlaying that, looked after the first wave of electrification at JLR, which included micro-hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and then battery electric vehicles in the form of the I-Pace. And so during that time, since then, I've been sort of working with various people within the supply base, looking at how this transition is likely to take place and what are the implications of it. And I believe that now, particularly in Europe, we're sort of well on our way on a pretty rapid transition, I think, away from automotive ICE engines into electrification. And I think that's due really as a combination of government policy, progress on reducing costs, and also now a wider customer choice of vehicles, which will expand dramatically over the next 18 months. And then also the need for OEMs to streamline their market offerings, and that again will accelerate change as we go forward. So look forward to people's questions. You're on mute now, Justin.
There we go. You see, yes, David. Just want to show some solidarity there. Ron, just on that, the supply chain side. Just your views on how it's changed, because having been through that ICE to electric vehicle type transition, I mean, it's an incredibly tough environment for OEMs, because they've invested huge amounts in the ICE arena for decades, and then quite suddenly, in automotive terms, the drivetrain is changing pretty quickly. So I mean, some of the sort of challenges and concerns, worries, risks that you've seen in your career around that would be really interesting on the supply chain side.
Well, I think in terms of risks, I mean, one of the things that we've seen is a lot of new people moving into the industry that are not really used to what automotive manufacturers have needed. And in particular, we found that with the battery cell manufacturers really quite often didn't understand what the requirements were of the industry. And they were putting forward technologies that weren't as robust as they needed to be, and they didn't understand the manufacturing constraints and often the compliance requirements that went with having to get things into the marketplace. Now, that's moved on, I think, dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years, but I think there's still a lot of that to go on. But also, we found that a lot of the tier ones were actually quite slow to pick up on where electrification was going, and quite a few of them actually got caught out by what was going on, and that in itself raised some interesting opportunities for smaller businesses. And so we've seen quite a lot of business startups that have become quite specialized in what they do, but have become quite important players in the markets that they're in. Power electronics is a great example where there was a lot of people that didn't realize how important the power electronics were going to be. And there's been quite a few smaller businesses have come in and made good inroads in that sort of business. Now, may well get taken over by the major companies again, but it was an area where there was quite a lot of innovation very quickly. And I still think we're in some respect, we're still in an era where the technology is quite risky, but is improving every time you look at it. It improves, and that's one of the reasons I think that a number of the OEMs have really tried to consolidate a lot of this work internally, and in many respects they're bypassing traditional tier ones and bringing the business in-house. There are other reasons for it as well, but that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, understood. Okay. We've got a question from the audience, from Trevor Langford. So thank you, Trevor. David, I'm going to give this to if I may put it this way, Ron, a current powertrain man, if I may, from a technical perspective, because it's quite. But do shout if there's an issue. I'm not aware of this report, but apparently there was one done by a company called ChangeDevs.com, stated possible new emissions scandal. So allegedly tests by transport and environment show PHEVs emit more pollution than claimed by OEMs. Will this recent revelation or the recent outcome from the report force OEMs or policies to totally remove fossil fuel vehicles sooner than projected targets? Is that fair for you, David? Is that okay? Put you on the spot there.
Well, I'll have a go. We aren't actually selling any plug-in hybrids, so can't directly comment on that. But and also don't sell them in Europe either. But I think this is symptomatic of the fact that for every certification cycle that you have, engineers' job is to design a vehicle such that it complies with the legislation to the letter. The issue with plug-in hybrids in use is clearly that if you don't use them in a plugged-in mode, it's been widely known that they're often not the most efficient of vehicles, because you're carrying around a whole load of additional hardware and equipment, and if you're not using it, this has gone all the way back to things like the Chevy Volt as a plug-in hybrid in the early days. If you do plug it in, you do use its all-electric range, it can be a very green vehicle. If you don't, it's simply a pretty poor series hybrid from time to time, and it can actually be quite bad for fuel economy and hence emissions. So I'm not familiar exactly with this report, and whether it's truly a scandal or whether it's simply a consequence of people not using the vehicles as they're intended, I don't know. The question of whether it will force OEM or policy to remove fossil fuels quicker, honestly, PHEVs are pretty much the worst of all worlds. From an engineering point of view, you have to accommodate a full-scale electric drivetrain, because the vehicle has to have adequate performance in all-electric mode, and you have to have a full-range IC engine system. So the engineers would be very happy to move away into a much simpler world where all battery electric is the answer. But until we've got over the range anxiety issue, of course, we've got consumer preference to account for. I don't know whether, Ron, you can add anything to that comment about PHEVs.
Yes, the report that was alluded to was, that is what it was, David. It was people running the vehicles without them being charged, which is an issue, and it's one that I think people may start to look at from a policy perspective, because the plug-in hybrids are an important component of the OEM's compliance strategy. And they use smaller batteries, so in terms of battery production, they fit with battery capacity as it is today. But if people don't use them, clearly the CO2 is worse than if there wasn't 200 kilos of battery in the car. And so I think it's one of those issues where actually they could change it very quickly by changing taxation, because most of the vehicles actually get a tax benefit from being a low emission vehicle. But the vehicle itself knows exactly what it's doing, and could easily at the end of the year talk about how much it's run in a hybrid mode. So I think it is an issue today. It's a risk to the OEMs, and they, I'm sure, would want something done about it. But there are mechanisms that could be used to try and improve that situation.
And I would just add, so far as policies to remove the vehicles or sooner, there are some real practical issues with that, because the OEMs are the ones who are probably investing the most in these vehicles in the main, in the first place. And secondly, they've invested in ICE vehicles for the last 50, 100 years at the same time. So there's a real transition there. And as the model, you've got a vehicle or a consumer product which has a model life of up to 10 years, and so changing these models in what is relatively a short space of time in automotive terms is a challenge in and of itself. So going from 2040 to 2030, although that's still 9 years away, that's in some instances that's one vehicle model. So that's a huge amount of investment and a huge amount of change in your business if you're going to meet that target. So I think it will. So I'm not sure that you will go anything sooner than 2030, because it would be. I mean, the auto industry, I think, as a whole, is still trying to come to terms with a new 2030 target, and I know that one of the exemptions, I think, is PHEVs actually to 2035. So whether that report or your comment affects that remains to be seen. But I think just have a, they're going as fast. They really are going as fast as they can. I mean, David, we've known each other quite a while, and you're right in the middle of it. But it's a big job to move from one drivetrain to another in such a short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, you're very right about the, you know, how near the horizon is, because you know, 2030 sounds temptingly far away, but you know, given that any major change in automotive has got a lead time of, you know, around 5 years if you're changing a lot, then, you know, we've got to be engineering those products pretty soon. They're a cycle away, and I'm sure Ron will talk about it in a minute, but you know, he's recently written a sort of thought leadership piece about the fact that the IC engine industry is, you know, already in the midst of this sort of death knell, which is the demise of it. But we have got to remember that the ramp up speed, notwithstanding all the great, you know, young suppliers that are coming into the market, we've got to get ramp up of the supply of components for us. And that is a matter of replacing, you know, every one of these ICE drivetrains that we've been buying, and, you know, global vehicle sales approaching 100 million a year. You've got an awful lot of replacement to do, and if we continue the trend we've been on with EVs of fitting what I would call larger than necessary batteries, the demand on the battery industry becomes, you know, phenomenally high, because that's the variable. You know, each car obviously it has one set of powertrain components, but the size of the battery, obviously the battery is still the largest cost item in the vehicle now as a single component, and the need to make better use of batteries, first of all fitting on average smaller batteries per vehicle. You know, there will still be large vehicle batteries needed, but equally there will be some hopefully some need for more modest vehicle batteries. But also I would say, and it kind of plays back towards Ron's point about potential taxation points. Currently we treat, you know, all BEVs and indeed all PHEVs as if they are equally meritorious from a saving the planet point of view. And that's not true. You know, that there are vehicles which have very high embedded CO2 because of very large batteries, but also vehicles that don't make particularly efficient use of the energy that they're given. And there, you know, there are one or two of the established EVs in the market today that are actually quite notorious for not going very far despite having very large batteries. And conversely, there are a few vehicles with quite small batteries that do have disproportionately large ranges. And we've got to do precisely what we've been doing with ICEs for the last few decades, which is rewarding good efficiency. And I think that you know, governments will slowly realise that to reduce the strain on, you know, generating capacity and plugged in places, you need to encourage people to drive the vehicle that goes the furthest on each kilowatt hour of energy that it consumes, and reward that somehow. Now, probably not right during this transition period. The first thing is to get people into those cars at all, but the second stage is definitely going to be to reward people for driving more efficient vehicles, because that will make us as an industry develop those vehicles. Right now there's not much payback for it.
Interesting. Okay, so moving on. Sorry, Ron, go ahead.
I think there's been a number of studies done that took into account the sort of the carbon footprint of manufacturing the car and the battery and everything as well. And what they do show is if the plug-in hybrid is used, actually you get to a carbon benefit faster than you do with a battery electric vehicle, because the battery is that much smaller. You know, it's you actually get a payback faster. So, you know, it's more about getting them to be used than it is about the core technology, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we've got some more questions coming in. So thought that so just moving on actually to a different area, used vehicles. This is from Alexandros Petcheridis, which I've probably pronounced incorrectly, Alexandros, so I've embarrassed me and you, I apologise. But the question is, what do you foresee about the transformation from used ICE cars to EVs? Do you know if there is a relevant policy or future plans towards it? Do you think it's a good investment? I presume that's investing in changing vehicles or in some way moving them to EV area. David, again, I'm not. I mean, I know quite a bit about the used car market. Moving it from a technical perspective, moving it to become EV, I think is a huge challenge, because the consumer would have to bear a lot of the costs, I would have thought, in if they wanted to do that, and that would be quite expensive. But the policy is that you change the new cars to battery electric vehicle over time, i.e. by 2030 all new cars will be basically battery electric vehicle, and then over time after that, that will replace the market, but you will still be able to use new vehicles. Be able to use used ICE vehicles for some time. However, and it's important there for the aftermarket, because aftermarket wise, that will mean there will be a period by which there will be the opportunity to continue doing business in that ICE area. Having said that, regulation again is a key factor here, because of city regulation. So you often have country regulation. You often, of course, and we know the regional European regulations, which we've talked about already today. But a lot of cities in China in particular, but also in the UK and the United States, are all setting their own emissions standards. And it's getting to a point. I mean, even in London, there are some roads and some times of the day that it's virtually impossible to drive on unless you have a battery electric vehicle. And again, that's going to drive behaviours. So that will drive, I think, people to change their used vehicle more quickly as well. So I think it's not so much what you do to the used vehicle. It's more about how do you get the consumer to change from a used vehicle to a battery electric vehicle sooner, if you will. Any thoughts, David, Ron?
I mean, I think this is always the thorny subject, is that the stopping sales of new ICE only vehicles at some point is only the start of the journey, and that we have an enormous vehicle park of ICE vehicles. Now, this has from time to time been the subject of scrappage policies. Obviously, it's recognised by governments, whether they're national or regional governments, that removing older vehicles from the vehicle park is much more effective than encouraging the sale of yet more vehicles with lower emissions. And we've seen in many cities around the world that slowly you chop off the lower end of the emissions tiers and prevent people from using vehicles, and therefore you don't force them to get rid of the vehicle, but you make the vehicle useless to them because they can't drive it where they need to go. So it's applying pressure, but it's a difficult social challenge, because and particularly in light of the recent pressure that's been placed on the world by COVID, the confidence in buying expensive consumer products is obviously lower, and nobody wants to be felt to be forced by government to make a large investment in a car that they think they've already got a perfectly adequate car. But there's going to be a trickle-down effect, because obviously at the minute the used EV market is a relatively niche place, so we don't have that many used EVs in circulation, but it will come, and once people get confidence in the residual value of those cars, and their the true life expectancy of batteries is perhaps a bit more confidently understood, both by consumers and of course by the trade itself, then people will have the option to trade in their used ICE car for a used EV, for example, at lower cost. And so that will help. And I mean, on a side story, I'm active in the classic car world, and I've seen a number of alarmist calls on the classic market message boards, asking whether the 2030 ban is going to mean the end of the classic car hobby. I think people have misinterpreted the no more sales of ICE vehicles to no more sales of fuel for ICE vehicles, which are two, quite different stories. Yes, we can look forward to, through probably taxation, and it's the same story as smoking and drinking. It'll become a socially unacceptable thing to do over time. But that is decades away, not years away. And what we've got to do is keep providing people with compelling reasons to want to buy an EV, as opposed to putting their arms up their back and forcing them to give up their ICE. We want them to have to, to say, I really want this vehicle. And whether that's through cost of ownership, where, the total cost of ownership model, arguably is break even already, even if the acquisition cost is still a little bit higher for an EV. You don't have to drive a lot of miles to see a decent return on your investment. And as soon as people work that out, they simply will be queuing up at the dealers for the cars we can provide, not have to be forced to go there by somebody telling them that they've got to give up their old car.
Mm-hmm. Ron, any final comments on that question?
To put it into context, I think the turnover rate for the vehicle fleet in the UK is between 17 and 19 years. So, we've even beyond 2030, we're going to have cars around potentially with IC engines for about another 20 years. The other thing I think that may well start to play into it, though, is as people look at the emissions regulations going forward, and companies, local governments start to monitor the performance of vehicles actually in the field, and look at the sort of high emitters and start penalising people for cars that aren't operating in their absolute optimum. Along with the age of a car goes poorer maintenance, vehicle wear and things like that. And I think what you'll see is increasingly in cities and places like that, vehicle monitoring of emissions through various different roadside measuring techniques that will begin to target older vehicles that are not operating at their optimum. And again, that will start to winnow people out of the marketplace, I think.
Okay. We've got a couple more questions coming through, but I did want to, with the esteemed panel that we have, Peter, I just wanted to ask them a question about some of the wider alternatives, alternative fuels, not just batteries, but just thinking about hydrogen, for example. I've often been told that it's the future, but then it always will be the future fuel for the future. So depending on your point of view, obviously, but how or what impact do you think the hydrogen fuel cell and or hydrogen in of itself in the combustion in driving vehicles will have, do you think, as an alternative in the future market, whether it be regionally here, locally, say in Europe here or the UK, or more globally? I guess, David, what's your thoughts? It's a big subject, but a couple of thoughts.
I'm sure Ron's got some very specific insight into some fuel cell applications that I happen to know. But the story with hydrogen, the problem with hydrogen is still the one that it was 40, 50 years ago, which is that you have to start every conversation about hydrogen transport by assuming green hydrogen is available, ... And the issue right now is that the majority of industrially used hydrogen is made from fossil fuel sources. It's made from natural gas. So it's certainly not a green fuel. The green hydrogen, so the electrolyzed seawater, for example, is a good solution, but it represents a tiny percentage of the available hydrogen today. We still haven't tackled the problem, not because we can't, but because we haven't had to, of moving hydrogen around in a cost-effective way. And the likelihood is that once we do start to put hydrogen into the energy economy, it's going to actually be to mitigate things like cooking fuels and and heating activities, not transport, because the transport industry needs such a lot of infrastructure to be put in place before you can move one vehicle. As an example, out in California, the California Fuel Cell Partnership put a very convincing in-field demonstration together some years ago by building hydrogen fueling facilities in a corridor from Los Angeles to San Francisco to prove that you could use hydrogen-powered vehicles. But it was only once they got these sort of fuel stations every 20 miles that everybody would actually drive would dare to drive their vehicles. The other challenge is that the level of purity of hydrogen that you need for hydrogen fuel cell is pretty high. They're not very tolerant of impure hydrogen. So one of the more tempting things to do is to burn it, which Germany had a big program led by BMW some years ago to look at hydrogen combustion, and also the heavy duty industry is currently getting quite interested in hydrogen combustion as a potential relatively low impact drop-in solution. Because a fuel cell vehicle, again, it's a bit like a PHEV. It's a very complicated thing. It's got a whole chemistry set as well as an EV, and usually some sort of battery, perhaps not very big, but something to get you started and to peakle up on demand. So they're not attractive things to have in the engineering world, and they're certainly not attractive things to have in terms of a proper supply chain. But they are, they definitely are. Hydrogen is an interesting energy vector, and if we get to the point where the massive build out of renewable energy sources are there, storing energy in hydrogen is a fairly sensible thing to do, because it's easier to store lots of hydrogen than it is to store lots of electricity. So yeah, it's coming. But as you say, fuel of the future, and it always will be. I think I may go to my grave with that, that echoing in my ears. I don't think I'm going to be driven to my final resting place in a hydrogen-fueled hearse. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I sort of agree with David that that we will find a place for hydrogen, but I doubt that it's going to be in mass automotive. Places where the importance of storage beyond the cost of converting electricity to hydrogen outweigh it, then it'll turn up in those sort of places. But also in the broader low carbon economy, there are so many other uses for green hydrogen that have an important requirement. So things like steel making and cement making and things like that are probably more important than the marginal use in automotive. So, undoubtedly there will be some hydrogen cars, but I kind of agree with David. I don't think it's a mass answer that's just waiting to happen.
You're on mute, Justin.
Thank you. So I think probably just the last question is around regulation. There's a question is basically, do we have global standards so that we can start to scrap existing non-EV vehicles to encourage them to go to EV? And could these standards be enforced globally, similar to the way they do for aircraft, for example? Now, I think we'll just get some final views and thoughts on the regulation. We have touched on this a number of times in the last few minutes, but the global regulation or the global change, the global guidance is really coming from the climate change accords, isn't it? Through, for example, Paris and so on, and then it's people signing up to that, which then has an effect on the government policy around their industries, and then the emissions of the industries in each of those countries. But the actual regulations that are enforced to create the right kind of vehicle for the road in a particular country or region is usually set by the local government or the local regional government. So in the case of EU, it's the EU. In the case of UK, from the 1st of January, it'll be the UK. But if you want to sell vehicles into the EU, you've got to follow their regulations. Similarly, in the United States, if you want to sell cars into the United States, you have to follow their regulations, but they are different. Not in their entirety, but they are different from country to country or region to region. But I think that it's an interesting thought, but I don't see it happening. I don't see us having global standards for vehicles very soon. I don't know whether you want to add to anything to that, David, Ron, just some final comments before we close. But it might be interesting from the point of view of where you see standards going, for example, technically, with batteries or with power, thinking like AutoSAR or, software and power electronics, for example. Do you think there'll be more global standards for those coming up in soon?
Yeah, I think the question about that's been asked by the viewer today is really about what standards are going to be used to determine what you should scrap out of your fleet. And to be honest, you're absolutely right. That's a local geography issue, and it will be a very regional thing. Cities will start first before countries because they have more. They're closer to the problem. What do you care if people in rural areas continue to use slightly higher polluting vehicles? Not really, because the density is very low. But and also, don't forget, it's not just about fuel use. It's also about air quality. And one of the bizarre benefits of our lockdown periods globally has been sudden increases or sudden improvements in air quality in cities. And there have been some pretty widespread circulation of pictures of well-known landmarks obscured by smog, and then not because people stopped driving vehicles in total. And obviously the message behind that is if you replace your vehicle driving with electric vehicle driving, you can keep that benefit. So there's going to be pressure on it. I think the story about using the FAA as an example for aircraft is a little different, because aircraft obviously have the capability of operating in many geographies during a day. They travel between continents, between countries. With cars, we typically have to design them and certify them for a market, and that's when they then spend the rest of their life. But your point is right about the standardization being there for the components and for the standards which we apply to those. And I think there is already, because EVs were a new thing, I think as a community, the global engineering community has got together pretty effectively, and barring a little bit of sort of format argument about charge plugs and so on, which is more or less over now. I think we've converged on having a fairly good international belief on what makes a car work, and certainly standards for design. There's ISO 26262, for example, for electrical safety, not just applying to EVs, but the integrity of what we do in automotive electronics. All of that is absolutely in the front of everybody's mind, and whether your boardroom's in Tokyo or Stuttgart or Coventry, it doesn't much matter. You're still trying not to kill people with the product you build, and there's a global consensus, I think, on how you apply international standards. Whether they're ISO standards, DIN standards, SAE standards. There's a lot of trade between them on EV components now.
I think conversely, the sort of the fractured nature of quality standards around the world is actually, from an OEM standpoint, is an impetus to developing electric vehicles and introducing them. Because if you try and maintain a conventional powertrains plus hybrids plus electric vehicle, and try and sell it into global markets. The 7 biggest markets have all got different fuel and quality standards. It's a massive task to undertake that. And as OEMs get to the point of cost parity between the conventional powertrains and the electric powertrains, there's actually little incentive to keep selling a complex lineup of products. And so I think a lot of that complex nature of the air quality standards in the end will be a reason why manufacturers will choose to put electric vehicles into those markets, because actually trying to get an electric car into a market is a heck of a lot easier than it is trying to get a conventional car in.
Justin, mute.
Thanks, David. Just so say a big thank you, David and Ron. Fantastic conversation, great questions. Thank you, audience. I hope that's been interesting and helpful. Peter, I guess over to you.
Well, for me and all the people watching, I would have said thank you as well. It was an absolutely superb session. I think we could go on a lot more with different things. Notwithstanding the reskilling of people that are heavily involved in the ICE, as I'll call it, engine and so on. But to as an end, our next session will be next Thursday, which will be covering 4 of our automotive supply chain awards for this year. Regrettably, not in Claridge's or anywhere where we can all go together and sit and enjoy it, because going to an award ceremony in a mast sitting 7 feet away where you have to throw someone an award is not particularly appealing. But the 4 award categories we will be presenting are sustainability, service excellence, battery logistics, and product innovation. But you'll see more of that on the site. It's next Thursday. It's going to have to be pre-recorded, I'm afraid, and it's not in person, but we'll look forward to that hopefully this time next year. But again, thank you very much for a super session, and let's all keep safe, and hopefully we can get together again over the next, albeit virtually, over the next month or so, and discuss other things that you think we should be talking about as well. But thanks, Justin. Thanks, David. Thanks, Ron. Great to see you all. And keep safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.